there are a lot of religions who seem to have an issue with it still, even to this day. Sort of, I mean, in your book, it was said that some people see it as the devil's birthday almost, or like demonic. I mean, is there anything to that, or do you think that they just need to sort of lighten up?
Well, that is based on a historical misconception, and that was one of the more interesting things that I managed to unearth in researching Trick or Treat that I had missed in my earlier books. I really was curious about where that came from, and I was able to trace it back to an 18th century British surveyor named Charles Vallancey. And Vallancey was sent by the British royalty over to Serpent. And while he was there, he became obsessed with Celtic history and lore, and he started writing his findings down, and he amassed a gigantic amount of information. He published it in a 6-volume set. And the only problem with this was that Vallancey was just a complete charlatan. He was roundly denounced by every major historian of the day. He decided just out of nowhere that the commonly accepted things that had been long established, like the meaning of Samhain being summer's end, were not true, that he knew better, and he went out of his way to try and connect the word Samhain to an Indian deity named Saman. And he, from that, went on, and it's impossible to read it, this completely daft conclusion that therefore the Celts worshipped a lord of death named Saman or something on this date. And everyone just at the time looked at that and said, well, that's ludicrous. But unfortunately, these 6 volumes of books found their way into libraries all over the world and created what I often think of as the strange alternate history of Halloween, which is that it is based on a celebration of a Celtic lord of death. And you can see that being perpetuated even in Halloween books of the 20th century. And I am fairly convinced that that's what led eventually to this notion that it is the devil's birthday and it's satanic in origin and so forth.
I suppose as well there is this link now with, even when you're not doing the sort of horror stuff and it's more about the pumpkins and it's got an autumnal feel about it, and you're sort of having the darker nights. There is also this link of, we seem to associate it with horror films and the horror genre, and much to my dislike, I'll say, me and my wife on Halloween will watch a horror film in the evening, and I can't stomach horror films, but she makes her watch it, and obviously a lot of horror films have that sort of demonic, satanic edge to them, a lot of them, and they're really far out, many of the satanic ones, but still there is that link. And you have written a absolute ton of horror short stories. I was looking through the list while I was preparing, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, how do you come up with the ideas for these stories?"
Yeah, I've written an awful lot of fiction, much of it Halloween themed. I've always just been a storyteller. I think when I was a kid, I was an only child, and we moved a lot, and so I would make up stories, I think, to entertain myself. And for me, ideas are not the hard part. Finding the time to actually sit down and write them is. So yeah, the ideas for me are everywhere. I can look out my window in my office right now and get 5 ideas in a few minutes. So, and I have been very fortunate to reach a point in my fiction career where I'm somewhat in demand. And so a lot of the stories that I write are to a particular theme. Oh, I'm editing an anthology based on Shakespeare. Can you give me a story for that? So quite often the idea is somewhat dictated by what you're being hired to present.
Right. That's so fun though, to be able to. I really admire that, because the idea stuff is just, it blows my mind. And when you read some horror fiction, you're thinking there, and some of them, when they're really out there, you read them and you're like, how did they think of this? How did they come up with this? As you being freaked out, that is. Have you ever written a story that is just you've been writing it and it's just been so spooky, like that it's freaked you out a bit?
There was one that freaked me out a bit, and it was a Halloween-themed novella called Summer's End, and I wanted to do something very challenging with that, which was, to make myself the main character. And I knew that was going to be difficult when I started it. For me, there had to be a sort of dividing line between the author and this main character, and it was a difficult write, but it did that one. Yeah, that one bothered me to write for, I think, obvious reasons.
Yeah. And what would you say was the spookiest story that you've written?
Um, I kind of want to leave that to readers to discover.
Okay.
I have written so many, it would be hard for me to pick one. I am probably at about 200 short stories right now, and 4 novels, and probably half a dozen novellas. So there's so much. I'm not sure I would have one that I pick as a favorite. I have probably 4 or 5 that would fall into my overall favorites category.
Right. Do you have a favorite horror film?
I do, which is The Exorcist. I saw The Exorcist when I was 15, and it was still in its original release, and it was a humongous hit. And seeing that film in a theater in 1974, when you were very young, was an absolute mind-blowing experience. And for me, it was not even so much about the film, but about how people reacted to it. It's hard now to explain to people who were not there, because there has not been a film like that since. But people were absolutely terrified by that film. They screamed, they ran out of the theater. People were passing out. I mean, it was insane. I remember just sitting in that theater in 1974, and actually even at some points turning around, looking behind me just to watch people and thinking, this is what I want to do. I want to have this kind of impact on people. So that was the film that kind of changed the destination of my life.
Right. That's so interesting. I didn't know it had that reaction. Was that like the first sort of big horror film?
It was, I mean, there had been Rosemary's Baby before that. But yeah, nothing before had that kind of impact on people, unless I mean, I've heard that the original Frankenstein in the 30s impacted people that way, but I certainly haven't seen it since. I don't know if it's even still possible to affect people that deeply. And it was interesting at the time, news, magazine covers would have stories called The Exorcist Frenzy, and you would go into, I remember a couple of weeks after the movie had been released, we were out at a restaurant, and our waitress looked very ill, and we were concerned for her. And we said, hey, are you okay? And she said, oh, I'm okay. I just haven't slept in 2 weeks since I saw that movie. It was just, the impact of this thing across the entire society was just insane.
Right. And what do you think about the current state of horror films? Because they seem to really just push them out now, and I don't know. What do you think about them?
To me, there are still some great ones being made. One of the interesting changes over the last couple of decades has been how much of it has moved to television. I almost think the best horror is now being done on television. There is a French series that's streamed on Netflix called Marianne, which is one of the absolute best things I've ever seen in horror. It is incredible. I think it's 8 episodes. I've watched it 3 times. Many of my horror writing friends have watched it over and over, and very few people know about it. So if you have Netflix, I highly recommend Marianne. Be prepared to be really scared. It's very frightening and really good. But yeah, sometimes I have older friends who will say, oh, there's no good horror being made. And to me, I think one of the things that our memories tend to do is we forget the crap we saw 30 or 40 years ago and just remember the really good ones. I mean, there's always been a glut of bad films being made, and we don't think about those after a while. And there are still things being made now that I think we will still be talking about in another 30 years.